Coffee is now the legal fuel of commuters, students, soldiers, office workers, and anyone pretending to understand an 8 a.m. meeting. But this ordinary brown drink once terrified rulers, financed empires, crossed oceans in stolen seeds, and helped turn crowded cafes into political pressure cookers. It began as a red fruit growing in the highlands of East Africa. Humans removed the flesh, dried the seed, roasted it until nearly burned, crushed it, poured hot water over it, and somehow created both a global industry and a personality trait. Along the way came religious arguments, coffeehouse conspiracies, colonial plantations, enslaved labor, corporate branding, and enough caffeine to keep industrial civilization answering emails. This is the story of how a bitter seed became the drink behind revolutions, empires, and the modern morning. Section 1. From red fruit to restless nights. In the highlands of Ethiopia, long before coffee came in paper cups with names misspelled on the side, it grew as a wild shrub bearing small red cherries. Inside each fruit sat two pale seeds. Nothing about them looked like the beginning of a global obsession. They were not brown, they were not fragrant. They were certainly not asking to be turned into a $12 seasonal beverage. Coffee's earliest history is difficult to pin down. The famous story of Kaldi, an Ethiopian goat herd who noticed his animals becoming unusually energetic after eating coffee cherries, appeared in written form centuries after the events it supposedly described. It is a good legend because it contains goats, accidental discovery, and a human watching animals make better dietary choices than he did. But the evidence is stronger for coffee's early use in northeastern Africa and its later development as a brewed drink across the Red Sea in Yemen. By the 15th century, Sufi communities in Yemen were using coffee to remain awake during long nights of prayer and devotion. This was caffeine before productivity software, a bitter tool for keeping the body present after the mind had already requested sleep. The drink itself required work. Coffee begins as fruit. The cherries must be picked, and the seeds removed from the pulp. Depending on the method, the fruit may be dried whole before the seeds are extracted, or the pulp may be stripped away first and the seeds fermented, washed and dried. Only later are they roasted. Heat transforms the green seeds, producing the dark color and hundreds of aromatic compounds associated with coffee. Then they are ground and brewed, allowing hot water to pull flavor, oils, acids, and caffeine into the cup. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine, a chemical signal that helps the brain register tiredness. It does not create energy. It briefly prevents exhaustion from filing the proper paperwork. Yemen gave coffee the system it needed to become more than a regional plant. Farmers cultivated it on terraced mountain slopes. Traders moved it through ports such as Mocha, whose name would later survive in coffee vocabulary long after most customers forgot it was a real place. From there, beans traveled through the Red Sea and into the commercial networks of the Islamic world. Coffee fit those networks unusually well. Once dried and processed, the seeds could survive transport. They were compact, valuable, and easy to prepare wherever water, heat, and poor sleep were available. Unlike wine, coffee was non-alcoholic, which helped it flourish in Muslim societies where alcohol was religiously restricted. It offered stimulation without intoxication, conversation without immediate collapse, and a respectable excuse to stay out late. That last feature would become politically inconvenient. As coffee spread through cities such as Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul, it escaped the quiet discipline of religious communities and entered public life. People gathered to drink, talk, listen to music, exchange news, play games, conduct business, and complain about rulers. Coffee had started as a seed in a mountain fruit. Now it was becoming a room full of awake people with opinions. Section 2. The coffeehouse becomes a political problem. By the 16th century, coffeehouses had appeared across major cities of the Ottoman Empire. In Istanbul, men crowded into rooms filled with conversation, smoke, games, poetry, gossip, and news. Some came to conduct business. Some came to hear stories. Others came to avoid going home, a tradition that required no further technological development. These establishments became known as places where information moved quickly. A merchant could hear about prices. A traveler could describe another city. A scholar could debate religion. A citizen could criticize government policy with several other citizens who had also consumed a stimulant. For rulers, this combination was not reassuring. Coffee itself was not the main concern. The problem was what happened when people drank it together. Coffee houses created public spaces outside the palace, mosque, market stall, and private home. They allowed strangers to meet, exchange ideas, and discover that their complaints were not unique. Authorities responded with the traditional governmental strategy for unfamiliar social behavior: prohibition, suspicion, and occasional destruction of furniture. In Mecca, officials attempted to suppress coffee houses in the early 16th century. Ottoman rulers also periodically restricted or banned them. Enforcement varied because coffee was already popular and officials were often coffee drinkers themselves. Banning caffeine while operating an empire was apparently difficult. One Ottoman sultan, Murad IV, became famous for harsh restrictions on coffee, tobacco, and alcohol during the 17th century. Accounts of his enforcement are surrounded by dramatic stories, some of which may have grown more theatrical over time. But the broader pattern is clear. Rulers repeatedly viewed coffeehouses as potential centers of disorder. They had reason to be nervous. Coffeehouses could spread satire, rumors, and criticism faster than official announcements. They became places where political reputations were dismantled one conversation at a time. No printing press was required. Just chairs, cups, and someone willing to say that the Grand Vizier appeared to have no idea what he was doing. Coffee changed the rhythm of public discussion because it encouraged alertness rather than intoxication. Taverns could produce arguments. Coffeehouses produced arguments with follow-up questions. This did not make every customer a revolutionary. Most people were probably discussing trade, family, local scandals, or the timeless mystery of why somebody else had received a larger cup. But governments rarely fear what everyone is saying. They fear what everyone might begin saying together. The drink continued spreading through Ottoman commercial networks and into Europe. Venetian merchants encountered coffee through Mediterranean trade, and by the 17th century, coffeehouses appeared in cities such as London, Oxford, Paris, and Vienna. Europe did not simply accept the new beverage. Some observers regarded it as foreign, suspicious, or religiously dangerous. Coffee arrived from the Muslim world, and Europeans had a long tradition of treating unfamiliar customs as threats before eventually commercializing them. According to a popular story, Pope Clement VIII tasted coffee after advisors urged him to condemn it. He supposedly enjoyed it enough to approve the drink instead. The details may be polished by legend, but coffee clearly overcame religious suspicion with impressive speed. Once Europeans discovered that the beverage helped merchants calculate, writers argue, and officials remain conscious through meetings, moral panic began losing to demand. The coffee house had survived the bans. Now it was preparing to become an institution. Section 3. The Penny Universities. In 17th century London, a man with 1 penny could buy a cup of coffee and spend hours listening to merchants, writers, scientists, sailors, politicians, and professional arguers discuss nearly everything happening on Earth. The coffee was not always excellent. The conversation was doing most of the work. London's first coffee houses appeared in the 1650s. Within decades, the city had hundreds of them, each attracting its own crowd. Some were popular with lawyers. Others gathered physicians, sailors, clergy, traders, writers, or men who seemed to have no employment beyond occupying the warmest chair and correcting everyone nearby. They were sometimes called penny universities because the price of a cup bought access to information that formal education kept behind expensive doors. A customer might hear news from overseas, learn the price of commodities, read a pamphlet, debate a scientific claim, or receive financial advice from a stranger whose main qualification was speaking confidently near a fireplace. Coffee houses worked because information was valuable and official news traveled slowly. Ships might arrive carrying letters, cargo, rumors, and reports from distant ports. Merchants wanted to know which vessels had survived, which wars had begun, which governments had changed the rules, and whether an overseas investment had become a fortune or an unusually elaborate way to lose money. Certain coffee houses evolved into specialized business centers. Edward Lloyd's establishment became a meeting place for merchants, ship owners, and men willing to insure voyages against loss. That network eventually developed into Lloyd's of London. Jonathan's Coffee House became associated with stockbrokers and commodity traders. Deal-making that had once occurred informally over cups and handwritten lists gradually helped create more organized financial markets. Humanity had taken roasted seeds from Yemen and used them to improve marine insurance. The plant was adapting well. Coffee houses also became engines of publishing. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated through crowded rooms. Writers collected gossip, arguments, and material. Political groups met. Scientific ideas moved beyond private correspondence and into public debate. The authorities noticed. In 1675, King Charles II issued a proclamation attempting to suppress coffee houses, accusing them of spreading false news and encouraging criticism of the government. The order provoked such resistance that it was withdrawn before it could be fully enforced. The Crown had discovered an important rule of politics: never threaten a population's caffeine and gossip at the same time. Across Europe, coffee houses became linked with the intellectual culture later associated with the Enlightenment. They did not create modern science, journalism, finance, or political debate by themselves, but they gave those activities places to gather, collide, and become louder. In 18th century Paris, cafes offered meeting grounds for writers, philosophers, political organizers, and people who would soon become extremely interested in the structural weaknesses of monarchy. During the French Revolution, cafes served as spaces where news and speeches circulated through an agitated public. Coffee did not cause the revolution. France had debt, inequality, food shortages, political paralysis, and a ruling system with the crisis management instincts of a decorative chair. But coffee helped provide rooms where people could discuss the disaster while remaining fully alert. The beverage had moved from religious vigils to commercial ports, then into urban public life. It was now supporting newspapers, financial markets, scientific societies, and political opposition. There was only one problem. Europe wanted far more coffee than Yemen could supply, and European empires had very specific ideas about solving shortages. Section 4. Stealing the seed. In the late 17th century, a Dutch trader looked at Yemen's coffee monopoly and reached the conclusion European empires usually reached when someone else controlled a valuable product. This arrangement was unacceptable. Yemeni producers protected their advantage by exporting coffee beans that had been boiled or roasted, making them useless for planting. Fertile seeds and living plants were not supposed to leave. The system worked until smugglers, merchants, diplomats, and colonial officials began treating agricultural theft as international economic policy. The Dutch obtained viable coffee plants and began cultivating them in their Asian colonies. By the early 18th century, plantations on Java were producing coffee for European markets. Java's climate was suitable. Its people were available to be taxed, controlled, and compelled to grow export crops. For colonial administrators, this was called efficiency. For local farmers, it meant land and labor being reorganized around a drink consumed thousands of miles away. Coffee trees require patience. They grow best in tropical regions, often at elevation, with the right balance of rainfall, temperature, shade, and drainage. After planting, a tree may take several years to produce a significant crop. Its cherries do not all ripen at once, so high-quality harvesting often requires repeated picking by hand. That is a great deal of careful work for something many customers will eventually purchase through a drive-thru without making eye contact. Once the cherries are harvested, they must be processed quickly. Leave the fruit sitting too long, and fermentation can damage the flavor. Dry it badly and mold becomes involved. Roast it poorly, and years of agricultural effort become a cup that tastes like a campfire dissolved in regret. Controlling coffee, therefore, meant controlling land, climate, knowledge, transport, and enormous amounts of labor. The French wanted their own supply. In the 1720s, a naval officer named Gabriel Declieux carried a coffee plant from France to Martinique. His account described storms, sabotage, pirates, and a water shortage during which he supposedly shared his ration with the fragile plant. Some details may have improved with retelling. Declieux was writing about himself, and men describing their own heroism have occasionally added seasoning. But the plant survived, and coffee cultivation spread through the Caribbean. From a few guarded seedlings came plantations producing vast quantities for Europe. The price of coffee fell, the human cost rose. In colonies such as Martinique, Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Cuba, and especially the French colony of Saint-Domingue, coffee production depended heavily on enslaved African labor. Workers cleared steep mountain land, planted trees, tended them, picked cherries, processed the crop, and carried it into an Atlantic economy designed to extract wealth from both soil and people. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue had become one of the world's largest coffee producers. It was also one of the most brutal slave societies in the Americas. The prosperity displayed in European cafes rested on coercion that customers rarely saw. A philosopher could debate liberty over a cup grown by people who possessed none. The contradiction did not remain safely overseas. In 1791, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose in revolt. After years of warfare, they defeated colonial armies and created Haiti, the first independent Black republic and the first nation born from a successful large-scale slave revolution. Coffee had helped enrich the colony. The system behind it helped make rebellion inevitable. Europe had broken Yemen's monopoly and made coffee cheaper, but the true price had not vanished. It had been transferred to plantations, mountainsides, and human bodies far from the cup. Section 5. America chooses a new morning drink. In December 1773, men disguised as Mohawk warriors climbed aboard ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The harbor became undrinkable. The symbolism was excellent. The protest targeted British taxation and imperial authority, not tea itself. American colonists had been drinking coffee for years, and tea did not immediately vanish after independence. But once tea became associated with British control, coffee gained a useful political advantage. It was not tea. Coffee houses already played an important role in colonial cities. Merchants met there, newspapers circulated there. Political arguments multiplied there. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, often described as a gathering place for revolutionary organizers, served coffee alongside stronger beverages for men who apparently wanted to plan rebellion with several levels of confidence. After independence, coffee became increasingly tied to American identity. Drinking it could be framed as practical, Republican, and pleasantly free of London telling you what to do. George Washington grew coffee at Mount Vernon only in the sense that he consumed it there. The climate was not interested in cooperating. The United States would become one of the world's largest coffee markets without producing significant amounts on the mainland, creating a national habit permanently dependent on distant farms and foreign trade. This dependence became obvious during war. By the 19th century, coffee was a standard part of military life. During the American Civil War, Union soldiers received green coffee beans as part of their rations. They roasted them in pans over campfires, crushed them with rifle butts, stones, or whatever else had not already been assigned a military purpose, and boiled the grounds in water. The result was probably not delicate. It was hot, caffeinated, and available. Under wartime conditions, that qualified as luxury. Soldiers wrote frequently about coffee in letters and diaries. It offered warmth, routine, stimulation, and a brief sense of normal life. A camp might be wet, cold, hungry, and surrounded by danger, but someone was still arguing that the coffee needed another minute. The Confederacy struggled to obtain beans because Union blockades restricted imports. Substitutes were made from roasted corn, rye, sweet potatoes, acorns, and chicory. These produced dark liquids with varying degrees of commitment to the concept of coffee. Real beans, therefore, became more than a comfort. They became evidence that a supply chain was functioning. Coffee suited the expanding United States because it matched the country's rhythms. It could be prepared over a campfire, in a farmhouse, aboard a ship, beside a railroad, or in a factory break room. It did not require ceremony. It required heat, water, and a willingness to accept bitterness as a personality-building exercise. As industrial work imposed stricter schedules, coffee helped people wake before sunrise, work longer hours, and remain alert around machinery. Employers did not invent caffeine, but they quickly recognized its professional possibilities. The drink also moved through waves of migration. European immigrants brought their own café traditions. New Orleans developed a strong coffee culture shaped by French influence, Caribbean trade, and the addition of chicory, especially when coffee became scarce. Urban cafes became meeting places for communities, artists, political groups, and workers. But America's growing appetite created a much larger question. Where would all those beans come from? The answer was Brazil, where landowners, merchants, and politicians were constructing a coffee economy on a scale the world had never seen. The United States had chosen its morning drink. Now another country would reorganize itself to fill the cup. Section 6. Brazil builds an empire in a cup. In 19th century Brazil, coffee trees spread across the hills around Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo in neat green rows. The landscape looked peaceful. The labor system was not. Brazil had the land, climate, ports, and political support needed to produce coffee on an enormous scale. As demand rose in the United States and Europe, plantation owners pushed cultivation deeper into the interior. Forests were cleared. Roads and railways followed. Towns expanded around warehouses, processing sites, and export routes. Coffee was no longer merely one crop among many. It was becoming the organizing principle of a country. The process began with the cherries. Workers picked the ripe fruit, often by stripping branches rather than selecting individual cherries. The harvest was dried, hulled to remove the outer layers, sorted, bagged, and transported toward ports such as Rio de Janeiro and Santos. Every stage demanded labor. For much of the 19th century, that labor was performed by enslaved people. Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Americas, and slavery remained legal there until 1888. On coffee plantations, enslaved workers faced long hours, physical punishment, disease, family separation, and the constant violence required to keep an entire economy operating against human freedom. The wealth moved upward. The suffering stayed in the fields. By the middle of the century, Brazil supplied a dominant share of the world's coffee. Plantation elites gained political influence. Banks financed expansion, and railroads carried sacks from inland estates to Atlantic ports. Coffee revenues helped build infrastructure and enrich landowners, merchants, and exporters. The crop did not simply use the economy. It began writing the economy's schedule. When slavery ended, plantation owners did not suddenly discover an interest in fair labor. They needed a new workforce, preferably one that could be paid as little as possible and blamed for requesting wages. Brazilian officials and landowners encouraged mass immigration, especially from Italy, Portugal, Spain, Japan, and other regions. Many immigrants arrived under contracts promising opportunity, but found themselves tied to plantations through debt, company stores, housing charges, and accounting systems designed with remarkable creativity and very little shame. Some workers eventually acquired land or moved into cities. Others faced conditions close to debt peonage. The legal category had changed. The desire for cheap, controllable labor had survived perfectly well. Meanwhile, coffee expanded westward into the fertile soils of São Paulo state. Railways reduced transport costs. The port of Santos became one of the great coffee export centers of the world. Profits flowed into urban development, industry, finance, and political power. Brazil's national politics became so closely linked to wealthy coffee interests that the early Republican period is often associated with an arrangement known as coffee with milk, a reference to the influence of São Paulo's coffee elite and Minas Gerais' dairy and agricultural interests. The phrase sounds like breakfast. It described oligarchy. There was another problem. Coffee trees kept producing. Plantation owners kept planting, and global supply could easily exceed demand. Too much coffee meant falling prices, which was unacceptable to producers who had built fortunes on the assumption that the public would remain permanently tired. Brazilian governments responded by buying surplus beans and holding them off the market to support prices. This policy, known as valorization, transformed the state into a giant warehouse manager attempting to protect coffee from the dangerous forces of people growing too much coffee. For a while, it worked. Then the global economy collapsed. By the late 1920s, Brazil was producing mountains of beans for buyers who were about to lose jobs, savings, and enthusiasm for premium beverages. When the Great Depression struck, warehouses filled with coffee that could not be sold at profitable prices. The government destroyed huge quantities of it. Beans were burned or dumped. Some were reportedly used as fuel. The drink that workers needed to remain productive was now being incinerated because the market had become too productive. Coffee had built railways, cities, fortunes, and a political class. It had also built a system so dependent on endless demand that abundance itself became a crisis. Section 7. The factory learns to sell wakefulness. By the early 20th century, coffee had become too important to remain a sack of anonymous beans sitting behind a grocery counter. It needed packaging. It needed advertising. Most importantly, it needed a brand name capable of convincing customers that one pile of roasted seeds was emotionally superior to another pile of roasted seeds. Industrial roasting changed the business. Large companies could buy green beans in bulk, roast them in centralized factories, grind them mechanically, seal them in standardized containers, and distribute the finished product across rail networks and national grocery chains. Consumers no longer needed to roast beans at home. Convenience improved. Control moved toward corporations. One early American success was Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee, sold in sealed packages after the Civil War. The company included coupons that customers could collect and exchange for household goods. Coffee had acquired loyalty rewards before airlines discovered how to make them impossible to use. Other brands followed. Folgers expanded from the West Coast. Maxwell House built its identity around consistency and the slogan, "Good to the last drop," a phrase later associated with President Theodore Roosevelt, although the exact origin is disputed. The message was simple. This coffee would taste the same every morning. That promise mattered in an industrial society. Factory schedules, office hours, commuter trains, and school bells demanded predictable wakefulness. Coffee became part of the machinery of time discipline. The clock said, "Work." The cup helped the body negotiate. Then came instant coffee. Attempts to create soluble coffee existed in several countries by the 19th century, but mass production expanded during the 20th. Manufacturers brewed coffee in factories, removed the water through drying processes, and left behind powder or crystals that could be restored by adding hot water. The flavor lost certain arguments with chemistry. But instant coffee was light, stable, quick, and easy to transport. During both world wars, it became useful in military rations. Soldiers could make coffee without grinders, elaborate equipment, or much concern for elegance. War had turned coffee into logistics. After 1938, Nestlé's Nescafé helped popularize instant coffee internationally. The product had emerged partly from efforts to find a use for surplus Brazilian beans. A market problem became a shelf-stable solution, because capitalism rarely wastes a crisis when it can dehydrate it. After World War II, coffee became deeply embedded in American domestic life. Advertising presented it as hospitality, comfort, productivity, and marital competence. Television commercials warned women that serving poor coffee might disappoint their husbands, because apparently the stability of the household rested on roast quality. At diners, bottomless cups became part of the landscape. Office coffee sat in glass pots, slowly developing the flavor of heated paperwork. Gas stations, factories, churches, and community meetings all had their own version. Then, late in the 20th century, coffee changed identities again. Specialty cafes emphasized origin, roast level, freshness, and brewing technique. Espresso drinks moved from immigrant neighborhoods and European traditions into mainstream American consumer culture. Starbucks expanded from a Seattle coffee retailer into a global chain, transforming coffee from a cheap refill into an experience with Italian vocabulary, customized milk, and a queue of people checking email. The bean became both mass product and affordable luxury, yet the supply chain remained uneven. Most coffee is still grown by millions of farmers in tropical regions, many of them operating small plots and exposed to unstable prices, crop disease, rising costs, and climate change. Retail prices may climb while producers receive only a limited share of what customers pay. Labels such as fair trade, organic, shade-grown, and direct trade attempt to address parts of this system. Their standards and results vary. They can improve conditions in some cases, but no sticker can make a global commodity chain simple. The modern cup may advertise a single mountain, farm, or farmer. Behind it still stand processors, exporters, traders, shipping companies, roasters, landlords, baristas, banks, and weather systems. Coffee became convenient because the complicated parts did not disappear. They moved behind the counter. Section 8. The cheap cup has a climate problem. On a steep farm in Colombia, Ethiopia, Honduras, or Vietnam, a coffee grower looks at trees that may take years to mature and cherries that must be harvested during a narrow window. Then the international market announces what all that work is worth. The market has never picked a cherry. It remains extremely confident. Coffee is one of the world's most heavily traded agricultural commodities. Tens of millions of people depend on it for income, from small farmers and seasonal pickers to mill workers, exporters, truck drivers, roasters, and baristas. The chain stretches across the planet. Yet most of the physical production happens inside a tropical belt between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Two species dominate commercial coffee. Arabica generally produces the sweeter, more aromatic flavors favored by specialty markets. It also prefers cooler conditions, often at higher elevations, and is vulnerable to heat, disease, and unpredictable weather. Robusta is hardier, more productive, and contains more caffeine. It is widely used in instant coffee and espresso blends. The name sounds like a Roman gladiator. It is still a plant and has several complaints about rising temperatures. Farmers face a basic economic trap. Coffee prices can rise and fall sharply, but trees cannot be planted, harvested, or replaced overnight. A grower makes decisions years before knowing what the crop will earn. When prices fall, buyers enjoy cheaper beans. Farmers still have land costs, fertilizer bills, wages, family expenses, and trees that remain stubbornly biological. The product became flexible. The producer did not. For much of the 20th century, international agreements attempted to stabilize coffee prices through export quotas. When that system collapsed in 1989, prices became more exposed to market swings. During later price crashes, many farmers struggled to cover production costs. Some abandoned coffee, others migrated in search of work. Meanwhile, customers in wealthy countries were being offered more choices than ever. Light roast, dark roast, cold brew, nitro, single origin, double origin, mushroom coffee, butter coffee, and beverages that contain coffee mostly as a historical reference. The value added near the consumer can be enormous. Roasting, branding, retail space, milk, flavoring, packaging, and convenience all increase the final price. The farmer's share is often much smaller than the name printed on the bag might suggest. Then climate change enters the supply chain without ordering anything. Higher temperatures can reduce suitable growing areas or push cultivation farther uphill. Rainfall becomes less predictable. Drought damages trees. Intense storms destroy roads and crops. Warmer conditions can help pests and diseases spread into regions that were once protected by altitude. Coffee leaf rust, a fungal disease that attacks leaves and weakens plants, has repeatedly devastated farms. An outbreak across Central America beginning in the early 2000s caused major crop losses and eliminated hundreds of thousands of jobs. The cup remained available. The crisis stayed mostly invisible to the person holding it. Researchers and farmers are responding with disease-resistant varieties, improved soil management, shade trees, irrigation, crop diversification, and new breeding programs. Some producers are moving higher, Others are testing plants that can survive warmer conditions. But adaptation costs money, time, and land. Small farmers often have the least access to all three. Consumers are increasingly told to examine labels, certifications, farm stories, and sourcing claims. These can provide useful information, but responsibility cannot rest entirely on a shopper. Standing in a grocery aisle trying to determine whether a bag decorated with mountains has solved agricultural inequality. Coffee's future depends on prices that support producers, supply chains that reward long-term farming, and serious preparation for a changing climate. For centuries, empires fought to control coffee's geography. Now the geography itself is moving. Otro, the cup on your desk. Coffee began as a red fruit on a shrub in the highlands of East Africa. Then humans became involved. The fruit crossed the Red Sea, kept worshippers awake, filled Ottoman coffee houses, irritated rulers, entered European ports, helped merchants trade information, and gave political arguments somewhere warm to sit. European empires stole fertile plants and carried them into colonies. Plantation owners turned to tropical land into export machines. Enslaved people and poorly paid workers absorbed the violence required to make coffee abundant, affordable, and conveniently distant from its consequences. Brazil built railways and political power around it. American soldiers boiled it over campfires. Factories roasted it by the ton. Advertisers turned it into domestic happiness. Corporations converted it into powder, pods, drive-through orders, subscription services, and beverages requiring several follow-up questions about milk. Today, coffee is so ordinary that its history disappears beneath the lid. A customer sees a cup. Behind it stand farmers waiting years for trees to mature, workers picking cherries by hand, mills removing fruit and parchment, exporters grading beans, ships crossing oceans, traders watching prices, roasters managing heat, and baristas explaining that the large is technically called something else. The cup may cost $3 or $8. The person who grew its most important ingredient may still be struggling to cover the next harvest. And now the climate that made coffee possible is becoming less predictable. Farms face heat, drought, disease, violent storms, and shifting growing zones. The drink that once expanded across the world may soon have to retreat uphill. None of this means the morning cup is a moral failure. It means ordinary products are rarely ordinary once their supply chains are allowed to speak. Coffee carries prayer, rebellion, slavery, migration, industrial discipline, advertising, climate risk, and several centuries of humans refusing to admit they are tired. So tomorrow morning, when the grinder starts, the office pot begins bubbling, or a drive-through employee hands over a cup through a small window, remember what you are holding, not just a drink. A seed that escaped a monopoly, crossed empires, survived revolutions, entered factories, conquered the workplace, and became the socially acceptable reason nobody should speak to you yet. If you want more funny histories of ordinary objects causing enormous problems, subscribe and comment which innocent product should face historical questioning next. Coffee wakes up the modern world. The bill has been brewing for centuries.